In a statement, Rand Merchant Bank says it investigated the matter when it surfaced in 2015 and had found no wrongdoing or unethical behavior. It says it's confident that it has not been party to any conspiracy to manipulate the currency. Meanwhile, Nedbank says it's committed to free and fair markets within a healthy and competitive landscape. It's in the process of reviewing the allegations and will respond in due course. The banks had previously argued that the Competition Commission had no jurisdiction to prosecute them.
The reason why we were asked to file a fresh papers on the matter is that the foreign banks especially had contested the jurisdiction of the South African authorities because the conduct happened outside the country. So we've had to go back and now show that even though the conduct happened outside the country, it had an immediate and direct impact on South Africa, as ordered by the Competition Appeal Court.
ABSA says when the Commission referred the matter to the Competition Tribunal, it did not seek any penalties against the bank. The case relates to collusion to fix prices and divide markets relating to the US dollar and the rand in contravention of the Competition Act. Some of the traders that were involved have since been dismissed, but the banks are yet to take responsibility for this. The Competition Commission is seeking 10% of the bank's turnover if they are found guilty of manipulating the exchange rate. Naledi Matlapeng, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, let's discuss this further. We're joined by Gary Booysen, Director at Rand Swiss. Gary, thank you for joining us. So the Competition Commissioner says these charges are not going away. How serious are they for this myriad of banks right now?
I think they're incredibly serious. If you look at just the penalty that the Competition Commission is able to charge, only 10% of annual turnover is absolutely immense. I think the issue around it is it's probably more serious for South African banks than it is for foreign banks, because I think the question around the jurisdiction is a valid one. It's going to be very difficult for the South African competition authorities to charge banks like JP Morgan, Citibank, Barclays Capital, Macquarie, BNP Paribas. These are international banks, and the ability of the South African Competition Tribunal, certainly, and the competition authorities is going to be limited. However, for our local banks that obviously do the majority of the business in South Africa, 10% of turnover in an environment as weak as we are now is very, very significant. And it's I think we had bank share prices up significantly today, but I think that potentially isn't justified given the threat of this case.
So let's try and put this in layman's terms. The Commission found that the banks directly and indirectly manipulated the rand level in relation to bids, offers, spreads, and the terms and margins. But let's start with the bids, offers, spreads. How did this actually work or allegedly work in practice?
Yeah, so it's very important to understand this because it hasn't really been made clear by the media. When you talk about manipulating the currency, or when you're looking at an antitrust case like this one, essentially, the idea that the banks are manipulating the currency to move the rand from, let's say, 17 rand up to 17 rand 20 for some sort of gain is not actually what is being talked about. When you're talking about the spread on the currency, it's when someone performs an international transaction, they are essentially showing a different price. Now, that price that they're showing is essentially what their fee is that they're charging. So to give you an example, if I was to go and buy dollars and I had rand and I wanted to buy dollars at 17 rand to the dollar, for every dollar that I take, for every 17 rand I take in, I'm going to receive $1. Now, what the bank will do is they will quote me a price saying that I in fact am not going to get the same amount. I'm potentially going to have to bring 17 rand 20 to the bank, and they will give me $1. So they essentially make it more expensive, and that's the pricing that they're talking about. So to give it in practical terms, if you're a South African and you want to use your foreign investment allowance, let's say that you wanted to take $10 million million rand overseas, and you wanted to take 10 million South African rand and move that into dollars. Essentially, the average spread that the bank is charging, and I mean, we've experienced this ourselves, when you go to one of our major banks and a client wants to move 10 million rand overseas, the potential fee that bank could charge could be up to as much as 400,000 rand to move 10 million rand. Now, that is just an astronomical amount given the ease of the transaction and given the, what potentially could be inside the spread. So, for example, we actually put as an authorized treasury outsourcer with the Reserve Bank. So we can essentially perform a similar sort of transaction, yet we can do it for close to 50,000 rand instead of 400,000 rand. Now, it doesn't matter whether you go to any of the South African banks as a retail client, you will be paying that enormous fee, and that, I think, is what the Competition Commission is targeting. The way that they're explaining it is potentially very different.
Yeah, Gary, I really want to push this point because there's been outrage, and I guess to many people it feels like, oh, was the rand at 17 rand to the dollar when it should have been at 15 rand to the dollar? Was it these bankers actually changing the level of the rand? So you're saying they can't do that. They can't change sort of the rand level that we would see on the board on the JSE, for example?
No, you see, to do that, the rand is one of the most liquid currencies in the world, and it's not just South African banks trading that. And even if there was, collusion across that level, the chances of them moving a currency as liquid and with the volume that is traded on our market, it would be incredibly difficult for them to do something like that. And I think that maybe is where there's a misunderstanding, because there's no way that a collusion of banks would be able to push the rand from 15 up to 17. It also potentially wouldn't be in the bank's interest to do that. There's no way of a bank, the bank wouldn't create revenue doing that either. It's really got to do with the pricing of your transfers. So if you're essentially moving money, it's the price that you're paying to move that money. It's not necessarily the rate. And I think that maybe is a better way of distinguishing it. The rate which the rand is trading is right now is around 17 rand. That's the rate of the currency. The price that you pay when you do a transaction, that's essentially the commission that the bank is taking. It's two totally different things. There's no way that you can blame the banks to say, given the local environment currently, they've moved the currency for some sort of illicit gains. That doesn't really make sense. Although that, again, I haven't seen the ins and outs of the competition commission's case. So that potentially could be the angle that they're going with, but that really it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah. Do you expect the banks to fight this? I mean, like you say, facing very serious fines, billions.
They of course they have to fight that. I mean, if the penalty is 10% of annual turnover, there's no way that it will be possible. And again, it really comes down to the specifics of this case. And I'm sure there's a strong legal system in South Africa. And if you look at the way that the rulings are made, within the Competition Commission and the Competition Tribunal, and now obviously we've had the Competition Appeal Court, overturning that ruling from June last year. We have a very robust legal system, so they will interrogate this to a large degree, and the investigation will certainly go through. And I'm sure, if there is any wrongdoing by the South African bank specifically, the penalties will be applied.
Gary, before I let you go, I mean, we were looking at how strong the rand is today, close to a 3-month high. This despite all the dread, we knew that the downgrades were coming, bad news across the world. Just encapsulate what's going on with the rand.
Yeah, so if you have a look at it, our currency again, because of its enormous liquidity, it becomes almost a proxy for emerging markets. So many international trading firms, many international, speculators and investors use the rand as a proxy for what's going on in emerging markets. So when you get a move away from risk, you see the rand selling off because people, they want to be in, the safe havens. They want to be in the likes of the US, Japan. They want to go to those developed developed market economies, and you see naturally the rand being traded almost as a proxy for that. So it becomes a bet on developed markets doing better. The same applies when you start seeing risk on moving back into the market, and that's essentially the environment that we're moving into now. We're seeing a lot of economies opening up. We're starting to see people going back to work. Kind of the fear that we had over the last 2 months is starting to subside. So you're starting to see more demand for emerging market currencies, and because of the liquidity of the rand, it becomes a natural beneficiary of a more risk appetite in the global economy, and that's why you're seeing the currency strengthen now. Certainly, I don't think it's got anything to do with manipulation from the banks there.
All right. Thank you, as always, Gary Booysen from Rand Swiss.